Brothers and sisters, something extraordinary has happened. For the first time in modern African memory, Interpol has issued a red notice, not against a warlord or fugitive, but against a sitting African leader who dared to say no to Western control. They say it is justice, but beneath the ink of that arrest warrant lies something far more sinister. This is not about law. It is not about peace. This is about power, about fear, about a crumbling empire that sees its grip on Africa slipping through its fingers. And standing in the center of this storm is a soldier not just of Burkina Faso, but of a continent rising from centuries of chains. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He speaks with fire, he stands with conviction. But the question that haunts the corridors of Paris, Washington, and Brussels is this. Is this a criminal pursuit or a global panic over Africa's awakening? Stay with us. This is not just about one man. It's about every African who dares to stand tall. Subscribe and lend your voice to the new dawn. Africa Rising begins now. Asterisk, asterisk. It began, not with gunfire, not with rebellion in the streets, but with a sheet of paper, a red notice, issued by Interpol, an international arrest warrant. But this was no ordinary notice. It did not target a money launderer in hiding, nor a war criminal on the run. It was aimed at a head of state, a young African captain whose voice has shaken the thrones of Europe and the palaces of the West. His name? Ibrahim Traoré. The warrant itself was short, technical, cold. It claimed violations of international norms. It alleged destabilization, but no detail, no court ruling, no trial, just an accusation. A command: arrest him, silence him, remove him from power. The world blinked, and Africa woke up. For many, it was déjà vu. Another African leader branded a criminal by systems built far from African soil. But for the people of Burkina Faso, and for millions across the continent, it was more than that. It was a line in the sand. The message from Paris, Washington, and Brussels was clear. Defy us, and we will make you pay. Not with bullets, not with armies, but with the most insidious weapon of the modern empire: international legitimacy. But what crime had Traoré committed? Had he stolen from his people? Had he called for war against his neighbors? His true crime was this: he had said no. No to mining contracts that robbed his country. No to military presence that answered only to foreign powers. No to playing the puppet while his people starved. He had spoken words the West cannot bear to hear. Africa will no longer kneel. And that they could not allow. So, the red notice was issued. Behind the closed doors of international diplomacy, it was dressed in legalese: stability, order, international cooperation. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, in the hills of Mali, in the markets of Accra, the truth was plain. This was not justice. This was a warning. They were not just hunting a man, they were sending a message. A message to every African leader who might think of nationalizing a mine. A message to every African youth who questions foreign control. A message to every nation that begins to believe in its own power. The irony is bitter. For decades, Interpol was hailed as neutral, apolitical, a global force for law. But today it stands accused of being the long arm of those who fear Africa rising. A tool of the powerful, chasing down the brave. The announcement of the warrant sent ripples across the continent. On social media, hashtags erupted. We stand with Traoré. Africa will not bow. Red notice red line. In the villages, elders recalled old days when they had to hide freedom fighters from colonial soldiers. In the universities, students debated the future. Was this the new phase of neo-colonialism? In his first public response, Captain Traoré did not flinch. He did not deny. He did not retreat. He looked the world in the eye and declared, "You can arrest my body, but not my people's will." And in that moment, the red notice transformed. No longer a symbol of guilt, it became a badge of resistance. Across Africa, leaders were forced to choose sides. Some called for calm, some kept silent. But others, especially in countries that have seen similar meddling, voiced their support. They saw in Traoré not a criminal, but a continuation of a legacy. A legacy of Patrice Lumumba, who was assassinated after daring to claim the Congo's wealth, of Thomas Sankara, killed after rejecting foreign aid and IMF chains, of Kwame Nkrumah, ousted after trying to build a truly united Africa. And now another name was being written beside theirs. But this time the people were watching in real time. This time, the streets are not silent. This time, Africa is not alone. In boardrooms in Paris, in strategy rooms in Washington, the worry is real. Because this is not just about Traore. This is about the spirit of a continent that has survived centuries of conquest and still refuses to die. And what terrifies the architects of global control is not that Traore will escape the warrant. It is that the red notice will fail, and in doing so, it will expose the system that created it. The West thought a piece of paper would scare Africa back into silence. But instead, it may have woken a giant. But what happens when a piece of paper ignites a continent's rage? The moment the red notice was announced, something extraordinary began to unfold, not just in Burkina Faso, but across an entire continent. It was as if a match had been struck in a room filled with dry kindling. The fire spread fast, and it spread deep. In the capital of Burkina Faso, Ouagadougou, the streets filled not with fear but with fury. Men, women, and children marched with handwritten signs that read, "We are all Traore. Interpol cannot arrest a people. Africa will not bow." But this was no ordinary protest. There were no calls for negotiation, no pleas for understanding. What emerged was a roar, a unified defiance, a statement to the world: this is not about one man. This is about all of us. And at the center of it all stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, calm, unshaken, his voice burning with resolve. "You can threaten me with prison. You can exile me. You can even kill me. But you cannot kill the will of the African people." His words cut through borders. In Nigeria, young students held forums titled, "The Real Meaning of the Red Notice." In Senegal, musicians began composing songs of resistance. In Uganda, activists printed T-shirts bearing Traoré's face next to the caption, "Not a fugitive, a freedom fighter." Suddenly, the warrant designed to isolate him became a banner of unity. But why? Why did this one act provoke such a groundswell of solidarity? Because Africans know history. We remember the patterns. When Patrice Lumumba demanded control over Congolese resources, he was assassinated. When Thomas Sankara turned his back on foreign aid, he was betrayed and murdered. When Nelson Mandela called out the injustice of apartheid, he was jailed for 27 years. Each time, the West claimed it was protecting peace. Each time, Africa paid in blood. So when Ibrahim Traoré became the next name added to the list, the people did not wait for permission to react. They recognized the signs, and this time, they refused to be silent. And the words of Traoré rang across the continent. "Let them call me a rebel. Let them call me a dictator. Let them call me a criminal. Their insults are badges of honor. Say for." In that sentence, he channeled the pain of a continent, but also the pride. He was not begging to be understood. He was declaring that Africa had outgrown its chains. At embassies across the continent, foreign diplomats took note. This was not just a political moment. It was cultural, spiritual, generational. The youth of Africa, long told to wait, to obey, to accept, were now standing tall. In Ghana, a young speaker at a university rally said it best. "We are not defending Traoré because he is perfect. We defend him because he dares, and daring is what we have lacked." The media tried to spin it. Western news outlets framed Traoré as erratic, authoritarian, dangerous. But their words rang hollow. In the age of digital memory, Africans had seen too many truth-tellers buried beneath the headlines of Western propaganda. And so, the more they attacked, the stronger the resistance grew. Soon, other African leaders began to speak carefully. At first, the president of Mali issued a cautious but clear statement. "We stand with any leader who prioritizes sovereignty and dignity over compliance." Even leaders often aligned with the West found themselves under pressure to respond. Civil society, youth unions, Pan-Africanist scholars, even artists all joined the chorus. This is not about one man. This is about Africa itself. The Red Notice, designed to be a scalpel, had become a sledgehammer breaking the silence that had long muffled African unity. And what of the African Union? What of ECOWAS? Many waited for them to denounce the warrant. They did not. Some expected them to speak with urgency. They stayed quiet. And that silence, too, spoke volumes. Because in this silence, the people found clarity. The old alliances were fragile. The old diplomacy had failed. The real power was now on the streets, in the minds, in the spirit of a rising generation. As Traore declared, "They fear our gold powering African homes, our oil fueling African factories, our uranium lighting African cities. They fear an Africa that keeps what is hers." These were not slogans. These were battle cries. And in the cafes of Dakar, in the taxis of Abidjan, in the farms of southern Ethiopia, people nodded, because they had seen it all before. Foreign companies taking 90% of mining profits. Local communities displaced with no compensation. Aid tied to contracts. Diplomacy tied to obedience. But now, here was a voice saying, "Enough." And behind that voice stood millions. This was not about Burkina Faso anymore. This was not even about West Africa. This was a continental confrontation, a reckoning, a reawakening. And so, the Interpol warrant, meant to intimidate, instead did something the West had not expected. It unified a fractured continent under a single burning idea: Africa must rise on its own terms. And yet, one question haunts every embassy in Africa: what if this rebellion becomes a revolution? With every act of resistance comes a price. And in the days following Traore's thunderous response to the Interpol warrant, the costs began to reveal themselves not in whispers, but in hard realities. Sanctions, suspensions, silent punishments. International banks began freezing cooperation with Burkina Faso's financial institutions. Certain aid packages, particularly those tied to European development partners, were postponed for review. Talks with foreign investors were abruptly canceled. Foreign embassies reduced their presence, citing security concerns. But let us be clear, this was not about security. It was about control, about punishing a country for daring to raise its voice. And the effects reached the people first. In the marketplaces of Ouagadougou, the price of imported goods began to rise. Medicines were harder to come by. Transactions in foreign currency were slowed. Traders murmured anxiously. Mothers queued longer at clinics. Farmers spoke of rising costs for fertilizer and tools. And yet, the spirit of the people did not waver. One woman selling tomatoes under the hot sun put it simply, "Yes, life is harder now, but at least we are suffering for our own future, not for someone else's fortune." That sentiment echoed across the country and beyond. For the cost of defiance was not merely economic, it was also political. Within Burkina Faso, old lines hardened. Those with ties to the old elite, once comfortable with foreign contracts and international NGO dinners, began to speak of recklessness, of isolationism. They warned of collapse, of instability. But the younger generation, the urban workers, the rural farmers, the soldiers who had seen their nation's wealth drained for decades, answered with one voice. Stability without dignity is slavery in disguise. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, far from retreating, doubled down. He announced new policies. A review of all foreign mining licenses. A moratorium on the export of strategic minerals until national processing systems are in place. An audit of foreign aid programs. International observers gasped. Western media called it economic suicide. But in the streets of Bobo Dioulasso, banners went up. Let it collapse. We'll rebuild it on our terms. The political landscape began to shift. Those who had once sat silently on the sidelines now stepped forward, some to criticize, others to declare allegiance. Pan-Africanist parties across the continent praised the bold moves. In Mali, solidarity marches broke out. In Niger, songs praising Traoré played on local radio. Even in South Africa, members of grassroots movements called on their government to reconsider who it calls partners. But with every show of unity, the pressure intensified. Behind closed doors, whispers turned into plans. Certain Western diplomats floated the idea of isolating Burkina Faso diplomatically. A prominent think tank in Europe suggested targeted sanctions. Intelligence reports hinted at support for internal alternatives, a phrase that African history knows all too well. The threat was clear. If you cannot be controlled, you will be replaced. But Traore, seasoned beyond his years, spoke again not to the West, but to his people. If they cut us off, we build new roads. If they isolate us, we strengthen our roots. If they threaten us, we answer with unity. This path is not easy, but it is ours. These were not the words of a man seeking approval. These were the words of someone willing to sacrifice comfort for sovereignty. And so, the choice before the people sharpened. Would they accept the hardship that comes with freedom? Or return to the convenience of chains, wrapped in soft language and foreign aid? The answer came not from the halls of power, but from the fields, the buses, the classrooms. People wore pins that read, "Sovereignty first." Street artists painted murals of African hands, breaking chains made of currency symbols. Radio shows began each day with a new slogan, "We own our wealth, or we own nothing." This was not policy. This was revolutionary culture, and it was spreading. But there were still those who hesitated, business owners who had grown comfortable with international supply chains, civil servants fearing the end of foreign-sponsored training programs, ordinary citizens anxious about rising costs. To them, a retired school teacher in the town of Kutugu offered this wisdom. Yes, freedom is expensive, but obedience has cost us more: our land, our pride, our future. This time, let us choose differently. And so, a new social contract began to take shape, not written in constitutions or parliaments, but forged in hardship and signed in resolve. The West had hoped the warrant would divide the nation. Instead, it did the opposite. It exposed the false peace that had long masked dependency. It raised a question that could no longer be ignored. In Burkina Faso and beyond, what good is stability if it comes at the cost of your soul? If you believe Africa's future must be owned by Africans, drop a yes in the comments. But outside Africa, the reaction was anything but silent. Outside Africa, the storm was brewing, but not where it could be easily seen. The real conversations were not on the news. They were behind closed doors. In Washington, the State Department issued a vague statement expressing concern over democratic backsliding in West Africa. In Paris, the Foreign Ministry called for regional stability and adherence to international norms. Brussels, ever fond of protocol, reminded Burkina Faso of its obligations under international cooperation frameworks. But nowhere did they address the real issue: why a nation refusing to hand over its resources should be labeled a threat. This silence, this calculated evasion, spoke louder than any press release. What the West fears is not Ibrahim Traoré himself. They do not fear his speeches. They do not fear his uniform. They fear his example. Because if one African country succeeds in defying their grip, others will follow. The real battle, then, is not legal. It is not even military. It is ideological. For decades, Western powers have cloaked their exploitation in the language of democracy, human rights, and development. But when African leaders choose true sovereignty, these words quickly unravel. Captain Traoré's refusal to comply has exposed this hypocrisy in real time. "You celebrate elections," he said, "as long as they elect your allies. You praise democracy, unless it delivers independence." Nowhere is this clearer than in the actions of Interpol. Once viewed as a neutral entity, Interpol is increasingly seen, especially across the global South, as a politicized tool, activated when Western interests are at risk. The warrant against Traoré did not emerge from a court. It emerged from a panic, a fear that Africa's children might finally stop selling their inheritance for scraps. And so, the machinery was set into motion. A red notice here, a funding cut there, a quiet phone call to a neighboring capital. Perhaps now is the time for a more cooperative leadership. It is a strategy as old as empire. If you cannot buy them, replace them. But something has changed. For once, the target of this pressure is not begging to be spared. He is declaring, calmly and clearly, the chains of paper mean nothing to a people who have broken the chains of iron. International media may still call him a rogue, but among the global South, a different narrative is emerging. In Latin America, leaders from Bolivia and Venezuela expressed cautious solidarity. In Southeast Asia, thinkers and writers are drawing parallels with their own colonial pasts. In the Caribbean, Old songs of revolution are playing again. The world is watching, and the world is asking, is this justice or just another empire in disguise? And this, perhaps, is the greatest irony. For all its tools, all its power, all its control, the West may have just reawakened something it tried to bury: African consciousness. And that, more than any leader or speech, may be their greatest fear. There is a moment in every struggle where the chants fade, the crowds thin, and the world waits to see what next. For Africa, and for Ibrahim Traoré, that moment is now. The question before us is not simply one of resistance, but of direction. Where do we go from here? After the speeches, after the sanctions, after the red notice, two paths lie ahead. The first is familiar. We have walked it before. It is the path of compliance where nations bow under pressure, accept foreign conditions for aid, hand over contracts for pennies, and call it partnership. It offers temporary relief, cheaper fuel, loans that seem generous until the repayment begins, comfort, yes, but always at the cost of control. The second path is harder. It is steep, rugged, lonely, but it leads to something greater: freedom that is truly our own. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, standing at that crossroads, has already chosen. Let them take their aid. Let them cut their deals. Our people will suffer less under hardship than under humiliation. This choice has sparked more than admiration. It has sparked planning. Across Africa, governments are quietly discussing regional trade in local currencies. Thinkers are writing new frameworks for development unchained from the IMF. Engineers are drafting plans for processing plants so that African minerals no longer leave the continent raw. And most importantly, the people are imagining differently. What if the gold in Burkina Faso built hospitals in Bobo Dioulasso? What if the uranium in Niger powered homes in Kano instead of street lamps in Paris? What if the oil in Angola fueled African factories, not foreign militaries? This is not fiction. It is possible. But only if we are bold. Keyword reminder: Africa Rising is no longer a slogan. It is a blueprint, a map, a declaration. And in this declaration, there is a message to every leader still hesitating. If you do not stand now, you may not get another chance. Traoré's fate remains uncertain. The pressure will not vanish. In fact, it will intensify. There will be temptations, threats, offers dressed as friendship. But whether he stands or falls, the wave he has helped to create cannot be stopped. Because something has shifted in the minds of the youth, in the hearts of workers, in the soil itself. Africa no longer wants to be saved. It wants to be respected. No longer wants pity. It demands equality. And no longer will it sell what is sacred for a seat at someone else's table. We will build our own table, from our own trees, with our own hands. That is the future Traoré speaks of. That is the future we must choose. And that is where our final message begins. This was never just about a warrant. It was never just about Ibrahim Traoré. It was about a continent that has endured centuries of plunder, humiliation, and false promises, and is finally saying, no more. Let the record show, when Interpol issued its red notice, they hoped to isolate a man. What they did instead was awaken a movement that stretches from the mountains of Ethiopia to the coasts of Senegal, from the copper mines of Zambia to the oil fields of Nigeria. A movement called Africa Rising, and this time, the world is watching. Because Africa is no longer asking for permission to exist on its own terms, it is demanding it. No longer pleading for scraps, it is reaching for the full harvest. No longer content to export raw minerals while importing poverty, it is ready to build. The cost will be great, the resistance will be fierce, but the path is clear. Traoré may be hunted, he may be demonized, but he has already won something that cannot be taken back. The confidence of a continent that has remembered its worth. And if we listen closely, we can hear the voices rising. Not me, not a single African will bow. That is more than a slogan. That is a pledge. So let them threaten, let them bribe, let them isolate. Africa is rising, and this time, it will not stop. Ibrahim Traoré may carry the torch today, but tomorrow, thousands more will carry it forward, because the spirit he has ignited cannot be arrested, cannot be silenced, and cannot be bought. The future belongs to us, and the red ink on their warrant will never outshine the fire now burning in African hearts. If this message beats in your chest like a drum, don't scroll. Like, share, and make your voice heard. Subscribe because Africa's silence is over. Our story is just beginning. Africa knew. Africa can do it. We stand with Traore. Africa will not bow.